Well, I think so. It's yeah. I would do it's like one of these moments. Yeah. When I close with spots, like I'm not one thing I'm getting back. I'm like with that. There's probably I just like what's the wedding? Yeah. Setmire, she was like, we was reading and stuff, and now on this social opportunities. I feel like that was this year. They were not.
Right. Right, good. Did everyone have a nice long weekend? Oh, yeah. It was weird. I feel like I haven't seen one in a really long time. Like we met again, and then we just vanished, right? So it's nice to have you back. Anyone else watch the football games this weekend? So many upsets. It was a great weekend of football. I'll get another one this weekend and then like 2 more weeks and then I have to be sad after that. But I'm excited for another good weekend. And I get to tell you to have another good weekend after today. So that's wild. And forgive me, I'm like fighting the end of like a sinus infection. So forgive me if I'm like a little sniffly. That's all it is. I get them like periodically. So that's how I spent my long weekend. Sadly, with a sinus infection, but also football. So fixed, right? But we'll jump back into where we were last time. And then I have a documentary that I want to show you today that I think is really, really interesting, that I hope you find entertaining as well. But we went through a bunch of different cultures and a bunch of different things to kind of get up to the Victorian era. And this is where we left off. So kind of talking about the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment. And so we ended with something kind of positive. So then we go back to kind of a restrictive time again. So a couple of slides and then we'll be caught up to where we'll jump into that documentary. But the Victorian era, really interesting period of time, named after Queen Victoria, who took the British throne in the 1800s. And I won't ask you dates at all. You don't need to know those, but just to kind of give you a frame of when we're talking about this period of time is a period of time that is very much marked by like what we would call like propriety and restraint and repression, at least publicly. And I think if you had to symbolically represent this period of time, the bodice or the corset is like a really good like symbolism for this period of time. Everything is like tied down, hidden, and tucked away. And as a fun side note, this is the Victorian era is where then Victoria's Secret, the store, comes from, got its name from this era. It was the idea of like the secret being underneath the clothing is kind of where that came out of. But this period of time, women are viewed as like completely asexual, that they're not interested in sex at all. Husbands and wives had to sleep in separate beds, right? It was just like such a period of time where we didn't talk about sexuality. And prostitution as a result, like absolutely took off and flourished, right? So maybe on the surface, things all seemed proper and like buttoned down and tied down and nobody's engaging in any kind of sex. But it was a period of time where prostitution was just absolutely massive and super popular because it was such a like repressed period of time. Yeah.
Didn't corsets do like massive amounts of damage to like spines and bones and stuff like that?
The early ones, like, I mean, they could, but I mean, it was more that they were just very restrictive, right? Like,
Right.
that it made it hard for like women to breathe. It was like the idea of literally like restricting everything. It was such a popular thing. Yeah, and like they weren't necessarily damaging. Yeah, like feed buying definitely can be very damaging plus long-term permanent issues. this was more just like, they're often uncomfortable, but then they're also often associated with sexuality and being like a sexy piece of clothing. Right, so it's interesting, it's kind of like dichotomized, which is very much representative of this period of time. Did you have a thought on this?
Yeah, it's actually like the idea of them being damaging
Yeah.
was actually created by men as a form of sexism to attack women for wearing it. And so like certain doctors would like make false accusations that it destroyed their like organs
Yeah,
because it was like a form to attack women for the clothing they were wearing and stuff.
yeah, and it was a very like the bodice, like, and the corset are very like sexual pieces of clothing, and yet they also represent repression. So it's like this really interesting period of time where you have a lot of sexuality that's very underground.
All that duality, all.
Oh, yeah, very much so, like that iconomized duality. Yeah.
There's a lot of like things that'll say that if a corset is right, it's not supposed to hurt you.
Right.
And a lot of it is kind of like in the media, it seems like corsets for like this related uncomfortability. And where if you look at like the actual undergarments, there's a lot under the corset too.
So many pieces.
So it's not, yeah, there's like padding and stuff that wasn't, that like we know.
Yeah, and they're actually making a big comeback, like they're very popular now, which is interesting how you see things kind of like reemerge. But yeah, they've gained a lot of popularity now, very different, like materials and structure, and we have a lot better like technology and access to, we've learned a lot over, obviously like 100 years or so. But yeah, women wore so many layers of clothing at this period of time, layer after layer after layer. And so more than being harmful, they were just very like restrictive, which I think is very symbolic of the time. And as I mentioned, at this period of time too, it was very like common, and in fact, almost like required, not that you could require it, but that was the only portrayal you would see, that husband and wife didn't even sleep together. That's how like repressed sexuality was at this period of time, and into like the early 1900s. Not so much as we get into like the 20s and the flapper era, but before that, very encouraged. And you would see anything in any kind of media or magazines or anything of the time that husbands and wives would sleep in separate beds, right? And I mentioned this last time too. There were all these interesting new threats to sexuality, like the bicycle, and later the automobile. Right, at just like scandalous things that like, you know, it was viewed like if women rode a bike, they wouldn't be satisfied by their husbands anymore, right? That cars were sex chariots, right, where people could have back seat shenanigans, right? Like it was hard to say. Really like a lot of sexuality, just very underground. People were supposed to be proper in public. And like sometimes that carried over into repression in relationships too. And so they sought other forms of sexuality to get that outlet and release. Yeah.
So does that mean like the medical industry and like the context of corsets and stuff like that was almost used as a means of propaganda?
How do you mean?
Like as in, oh, this is gonna hurt you, it's bad for you, you shouldn't wear this.
I mean, maybe a little bit, but it
This
was
seems
more
like direct misinformation.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of misinformation, and a lot of people knew nothing about sexuality. We're going to talk in chapter 2 about Kinsey, who was teaching like human sexuality courses in like the 30s and 40s, and people had no idea what pieces of anatomy were, what like how you would orgasm, what it meant to be homosexual. Like, I mean, we knew so little because people weren't talking about it at this period of time. It was just very underground. Yeah.
I was gonna say, it must be a thing of propaganda and more so just like bias in the medical.
Yeah, I think
because
bias is a better word.
There's like, at that point, like men as like doctors mainly,
Mhm.
basically entirely, and not having as much knowledge.
Right.
of certain things, and those things were not as much investigated. Even now, we don't have as much information on women's bodies as men. So it might be more of that kind of deal instead of a deal of, oh, we're purposely telling you the wrong thing.
Yeah.
We're misunderstanding the right thing.
I think that's a good way of putting it. And then also just a lot of like, just not talking about sexuality, period, not in public anyway, right? It was just something that was very discouraged to do. And you'll see like, as we come out of this era and into the 20s, we swing really far the other way, right? Just interesting how we go from one to the other, but prostitution, very, very dominant during this time where people weren't showing that behavior outwardly, but it was very much there. If we look at like the early Americas, so just one more slide here and then we'll get to that documentary. If we look at like early American sexuality, because we've been talking mainly about other cultures in Europe, we get the Puritans. Now, if you think of the Puritans, I don't know how many of you have read like The Crucible. My partner's an English teacher and they've read The Crucible last semester. But The Crucible and like the Puritans, very, very like severe sanctions for anything outside of marriage. Sex outside of marriage, forbidden, right? You would be accused of like adultery. You could be put to death or banished from the community for like cheating on a partner. It was a very, very like restrictive time in the early like American sexuality, but they tried to have a few things that were a little more progressive. One of them was a new practice called bundling. Bundling is comical, right? It's like the funniest idea ever. It was this thought that people who were about to get married should be able to spend the night with their future partner, but not have sex with them. And the way that we ensure that they don't have sex is we put a little board in between them in the bed. Like you couldn't just hop right over that thing, right? Or even better, we sew you into a bundling sack. So you literally the man would sleep in a sack, right? Where they couldn't get out of it, so they wouldn't be able to engage in any kind of inappropriate behavior with their future wife. Now, once you're married, totally fine. But before marriage, no way. But we wanted to let them, or they wanted to let them be able to start building that relationship with their future partner. So you could sleep together, but you couldn't have sex with each other because of the bundling bag or the bundling board. I found a little clip of this, which is wild. It's from an older movie called The Patriot. It had Heath Ledger in it. And they show like he's being sewn up into a bundling bag so that they can spend the night together. So I'll play it for you. It's just like a minute or two, but it's a great example. And again, comical now, but at the time it was considered very progressive to allow this. Side of marriage, but within marriage, right, sex was allowed and permissible. Just a lot of rules related to that, and sex before marriage as well. We get a lot of influence from like the influx of slavery, right, in the early Americas, right, in the late 1700s. A lot of rules related to like interracial sexuality and marriage as well. Forbidding sexuality or marriage between people of different races is a very big focus of like the late 1700s with slavery. And then as we get into like the 1800s, we start to focus on more medical models of sexuality. Social hygiene was something that became big. Now, these sexually transmitted diseases and infections have been around a very long time. But when we get into the 1800s, we start focusing a little bit more on sexual health and education campaigns to like educate people, especially soldiers, about the dangers of, not protecting yourself in some way during sex. Early protection methods, the condom was originally made out of a sheep intestine, right? And so like some of the early ways, isn't that awful to imagine? The early ways of protecting yourself related to sexuality were like good hygiene, taking showers or baths rather, and washing yourself and being clean. And then we've learned more and more as we've progressed, throughout time. So some kind of early ideas very much shaped by the other cultures that we've been talking about. As we start to get into like the 1900s and 20th century sexuality. And the 20th century, just an absolute huge range of ideas and norms as we go from like early 1900s to closer to 2000. And as I mentioned, I have a documentary that I want to play for you related to this. The computer didn't work, but I've recorded it. So thankfully, so I can still play it for you. And I'll post this video on Canvas as well, in case you wanted to watch it again or go back to it. But here are some kind of like highlights that I put on the slide. But you don't have to take notes during the documentary, just pay attention. I might write a term or two on the board that they go over. But I think it's super interesting. They start with things like the bicycle and then move to the automobile and just how little we knew all the way kind of leading up to the development of the internet. It takes us up to about like 2000 or so. So it's about 40 minutes, I want to say, but I think it's well worth it. I hope you find it interesting. So I'm going to pause with I can't remember if I share. I'm watching Peaky Blinders right now. I'm like almost done with it, and it's like all in this like early 1900s. So it's kind of fun to see some of that as well. But I wrote a term up here, prophylactic. They use this term a bunch in that documentary, and just in case you were curious what that was, I wanted to define it for you. It means an advanced guard. And so what people would do, I mean, traditionally men, after they had unprotected sex, is they would go to a prophylactic station where they would oftentimes like have a wash station set up where they could like wash their penis and like clean themselves up as a way to like prevent getting an STI or an STD. They talked a lot about like venereal diseases and social diseases, which would be what we would call STDs or STIs now. And so we see just a lot of like things really influencing our modern sexuality, from the different wars affecting gender roles, from the like availability of the condom and the pill and some birth control methods, a lot of different like movements and people like Kinsey and Masters and Johnson, we'll talk more about next week. Just a lot of different things to get us to today. All right, so really fascinating. You'll see a little bit more of that when we talk about Kinsey, of like an excerpt from a documentary on him as well. But I mean, we just didn't know so many things as it related to sexuality, and like the bicycle and the automobile, just fascinating. And when we watched the Kinsey documentary, I mean, people had to get married to take human sexuality classes. Like that was like the level of you know, how uncomfortable people were with just even talking about sexuality. So, you know, just a couple of highlights on here. And I want to talk for one more minute about like the media and the role of like the media and sexuality. And they showed you a little excerpt in there of The Kiss. The Kiss was like this incredibly scandalous film that people lined up to go see. Right. And they said in there that people spent like nickel after nickel. I wish it was a nickel to see movies, right? That would be so nice. But people went to this film to see what they had never seen before. And it was something that people rioted about. They tried to ban it. It was so scandalous that you couldn't believe that it would be shown in a movie theater. Right. And I have that excerpt from The Kiss. I'd like to show it to you. And keep in mind that, again, this was like absolutely ludicrously like scandalous 100 years ago. Yeah, that's the end, right? So incredibly awkward, right? But people would pass out and faint because it was something they had never seen before. It was that scandalous. Like, contrast that with like what you see on TV now, right? Like just I forget what we were watching yesterday, and like I didn't even turn it off when my kids walked in because it wasn't like anything that would shock them at 9 and 11. That was something that shocked and like upset adults 100 years ago, 120 something years ago. So it just, the media tends to set the tone for what's like normal at the time. And it's so fascinating to watch like how the media changes and how what's out in the world changes and how it creates these metrics of normality, right? And like there are always like certain movies or films or books that kind of push that. Like if you go back, what, like 10 years or so, like the 50 Shades books were like scandalous and people like tried to fight them. And now they're like normalized and BDSM has taken off because of them, right? It's just fascinating to see how like what we're advertising and what we're putting out in the media kind of creates these norms. And the internet was a huge one for creating norms. You got to love the awkward chat room conversations that were happening in the documentary with like the 12-inch tongue, if you saw that or whatever, right? It just, you know, just chat rooms were a big game changer. The internet was a game changer. Dating sites, you know, it's just constantly pushing the envelope. What's normal in advertising and magazines. We use a lot of sexuality in advertising, which we'll talk about later in the semester. But this whole chapter is just kind of about like, you know, what has influenced sexuality in our country, and the media is definitely a huge purveyor of sexuality for us, right? Things on social media and in the media in general. So what we'll do next time is we'll build on this a little bit by looking at chapter 2. In chapter 2, we'll talk about some of the famous sex researchers and some of the like early sex research And then we'll do a little kind of interesting activity that I'll tell you more about next time. We'll do on Wednesday. So I'll just leave you in hopefully like excited anticipation, nervous anticipation maybe of that. We'll do our own little sex research experiment in here. We'll see what happens. I've done it a few times. It's always interesting. So I look forward to it. So more on that on Monday. So on Monday, we'll move to chapter 2 if you want to start looking over that in the book. So I'll have you go ahead if you want to pack up. We'll end a few minutes early so I can take attendance one last time. And then next week, I'll just pass around an attendance sheet. And those.